Hello, I am Warren Scheel, and we have a first for today. I'm going to be interviewing the very distinguished psychologist, Dr. Mark Burdick. Let's take off this mask. For future generations, we were still in COVID, and this is the day after the American presidential election. It's a first because apparently, although it could go on for a while.
It seems to be going on. Yeah, that's my take on it.
Well, this is a first for me because I'm from Los Angeles, California. And Mark, where are you right now?
You're not from Los Angeles, California. You're from you're from bloody old England.
London.
You know, and we knew you back when the Kinks were, coming about. I'm in Amsterdam as we speak, and I happen to be here because we have an apartment, and our daughter is pregnant in the family way. So we're going back and forth. Thank you. She's happy as well. She has a partner, so it's all good. And so we came over, but I'm happy to be here with you, and I am in Amsterdam at the moment.
Well, I'm very pleased to have you with us, Mark. Let me just explain that you are a psychologist practicing in both the US, primarily California, I believe, but you're also a psychologist and you're board certified in the United Kingdom. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, I'm a chartered psychologist, associate fellow.
And you're a fellow of the British Psychological Society.
Yeah.
And you were the chairman of the California Board of Behavioral Sciences.
Thanks to Gray Davis and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yeah.
So what is that board?
That's the licensure board for mental health practitioners in the state of California. I was also the executive director for the California Association of Licensed Education Psychologists, which is called CALIP. And that was for about 10 years. So I have a lot of administrative experience under my belt.
And we were sort of slated to talk about educational placement in family law and divorces. Although I'm going to veer from the subject because, as I said, this is the night after the polls closed in the US presidential elections. So perhaps we should talk a little bit about trauma and how to deal with trauma.
Well, the Dutch are very, for the longest time, they would ask, how did you get to this place where you have, this Republican as a party leader? And then they had their own problems. And then Boris Johnson came along. And so it kind of started to follow a pattern. Now it's, why can't you continue with the tallying of the votes? How can you call an election until every vote is counted? And I have a difficult time, answering that question because as an American, everyone is entitled to their vote, and the Dutch don't seem to get how someone could call an election before every vote gets counted.
Well, the truth is under the Constitution and under the various election laws in the US, you can't call an election until every vote's counted. So it's simply forced to say that the election is decided when the polls close on election night. It's never been the case historically, and it never will be the case. I think that there's another, I'm talking as a Brit, even though I now live and practice in Los Angeles. It's cast a light on the vagaries or the unusual procedures of election laws in the US. Most other countries, I think in Europe, have a system of either proportional representation, or they have a system where the party in power usually gets the most votes. It's reflected in the votes, whereas in the US on a frequent basis, both in the Senate and the House and the presidency, the winner is the person who gets the least amount of votes. And it's very difficult to explain that to people.
Yeah.
Why is that the case?
They don't get the concept. But in any case, I hope your man wins.
Thank you. That's very politically correct.
So, and meanwhile, yeah, I appreciate you allowing me to be on the YouTube with you, and I think it's great. I've been listening to other um, people, attorneys and judges and such, and I'm quite amazed that you have, not for you, but I mean, it's something that needs to get out to other practitioners, just what you're doing, because it's a good thing.
Thanks.
It's
We've
bringing
had some,
information.
we've, like yourself, we've had some very good people on. So I
Yeah.
want to turn it over to um, educational placement. And you sent me an article which was in the American Journal of Forensic Psychology, Education Opinion for Custody Evaluators. And one
Yep.
of the things that struck me was that you said somewhere that many many evaluators who do a custody evaluation weren't necessarily that familiar with the importance and how to assess educational placement. Just briefly talk about why it's important, why educational placement is an important factor in making choices, custody choices.
You know, Warren, the last few cases that I've had, I was reviewing those, and I have been working strategically with John Gould, who is an expert in the area of child custody evaluations, with who was the co-author. I was the principal author of this article. And the crux of the article is that we don't have within family law a template to follow for educational specialists to say this is what needs to get sorted out. This is the manner in which that you would sort it out within family law. And so I think what the issue is when you're looking at other evaluators. I recently had kind of a bit of a challenge with a guardian ad litem out of Florida, in which the question was posed by the judge. So which is the better school? And so the guardian ad litem took it to task to find the better school within the better school district. Well, that really isn't the question, because that doesn't go along with fit. What's in the best interest of that child? That best interest of child is multidimensional, but to just go back and say we have to find which is the better school doesn't answer that question. So I think, you know, educational psychologists, and I'm both an educational and a clinical psychologist with forensic training, so I speak out of both sides of my mouth. But as an educator, I recognize the importance of really getting the profile right, because you're talking about placement, whether it's in a public or a private spot, school, treatment center, whatever it happens to be. You have to be thinking, is this person, young individual, going to take to that manner, to that approach, to that particular team, those educators, how are they going to fit in with that peer group at the end of the day? And I think it really takes an educational background to understand really how education works and how schools work. You know, I've been practicing for, I hate to say 40 years, but it's true.
You don't
And
look
at
that
the end
old.
of the
You're
day,
much younger, Mark. Much younger.
I'm just, I'm a fifth Beatle, so I still feel that way.
You look like a fifth Beatle.
Thank you. But I think at the end of the day, you really have to say, if I was a child in that classroom, would I feel that I fit in? Would I get my needs met?
Right.
And so that's the crux of the article.
So let's look at that, because I'm a parent. I've got children who are 12 right now, and I'm pretty well educated. I went to college in America and college in the UK. And when we were making decisions, we went to all the schools, we visited the schools. And to be honest with you, it was a really, really difficult decision. I felt that I didn't necessarily have the tools or the metrics to make the best decision. And so, so you talked about the fit, um, um, and so I want to look at that. First of all, how do you decide what metrics or data to use to look to see what the child's capabilities are and how the child performs currently in a school? Is that part of the
Yeah,
process?
it is, and I think, you know, fundamentally, here's the rub, is that, you know, you have your own marching orders internally as a practitioner who is well versed in this area to say, I need the records of the child. I need to have an interview with the teacher and with the administrator at the school. I need to have the parents on board with this process. I need to have, you know, anyone else who's been involved, like an educational tutor or a consultant involved in it. I need to get as much feedback. Now, if the court doesn't set the tone for that, the likelihood of all of that falling into place is mired in all sorts of muck. So you don't want to get into that kind of a situation. You really want to get it at the beginning so everybody understands that you need to have access through what we call FERPA, which is a, you know, family mechanism with US law, where we can actually talk to these people, because people will throw roadblocks at you. And I'm pretty good at avoiding the roadblocks. I know the territory, I know what's about to happen, and I know what the people are going to ask of me. But it takes some level of authority. So when I go in, I do ask for records. I want to know, you know, where the child has been, how they've gotten to this place, you know, what the expectations are for the parents themselves. What are they thinking that's in the best interest of the child in terms of education? What resources they've made available, what resources they feel they need to make available, and so on. And when we look at standardized testing, that's certainly, you know, one rubric, but we look at classroom attendance and classroom performance and you know, all that sort of a thing, and determining, you know, if it's in a move away case or if it's just in a therapeutic placement or what needs to happen. Then I start formulating what I think would be in the best interest of the child. And actually, I'll go back to the attorneys and say, here's what I'm thinking. And I'll go back to the parents and say, here's what I'm thinking. I like a collaborative process. I don't like something that just falls apart at the 11th hour in a private judge's quarters and saying, this is never going to work for us. You have to have all stakeholders on board.
Well, that's a good question. If it is a high conflict divorce,
Right.
and it doesn't feel like there is cooperation between the parents, but nevertheless, the judge or the private judge makes an order defining the scope of the educational assessment, and then requires all the parents sign the necessary consents so that you can speak to the children, you could speak to the teachers. Can you still do your job, or can the parents still throw up roadblocks?
Well, of course, I kind of look at it as food in a way. When you're sitting down to dinner or you're going into a restaurant, nobody really objects to food. They'll say, okay, I don't like the way it was prepared. I don't, you know, I might have, so I wanted asparagus instead of an artichoke or what have you. But at the end of the day, most parents will say, I understand my child needs to be educated. I'm not going to interfere with that process. I don't find a great deal of trouble, except when it's said, come hell or high water, we're going to move, and that's what's going to happen. And if there's a stiff, you know, type of, you know, decisive manner or approach that's taken on part of one of the parents, and it gets complicated. If in fact it can't, if there is a definitive roadblock that comes up, then I think it needs to be discussed, you know, with the attorneys to say how we're going to get past this. And then I try my best to resolve it regardless.
Now, do you always get cooperation from the school and the teachers when you want to go and visit and interview?
That's when I was saying FERPA, because FERPA is the Federal Educator Rights Act, which allows for you to go in and gain that information, those records from that schools. And oftentimes they will say, I don't have a release from this one parent, or I have one parent releasing and that's good enough for me. It changes depending upon who the administrator is on what particular day. I'll go back and say, you know, rightfully you need to have both parents on board, but you know, go ahead and make that call now. I'll wait for that and make sure that everybody's okay with it. But with FERPA, it allows for someone like me to go in and gain access to records.
Now, after reading your article, it seems that the model that most parents use in this situation is that they narrow down their school choices, and then each parent presents you with one or two of their, you know, preferred schools. Is that the model you like to use?
Yeah, maybe two. You know, if it's just for a private or a public school placement, if it's for a therapeutic school placement, which I think you understand about therapeutic schools, where they're actually leaving the school that they're in and they're attending a school that is primarily education and therapy rolled into one, then there may only be one choice that the parent is looking at. In so much as I have had decades of experience in this particular venue, I sometimes go back to the parent and say, really? You know, there are schools that you need to look at that I think are going to do a better job, you know, for what you're suggesting. And in terms of family work, that's an important concept when it comes down to therapeutic school placement. Typically on a private or a public school move away case, there's one school or two schools that they're looking at. And I have to help sort them out. What makes more sense with the profile of the student.
With the exception of therapeutic schools, do you ever do you have a database or a large know-how of schools in the LA County area? So sometimes you can come back to the parents and say either this public school or this private school might be a better fit.
Of course, the private school, you know, it's dependent on whether there's a waiting list and whether that makes sense. That's one thing, but I have relationships with people. And so I'll use those relationships and say, listen, this person would be exceptional for your school. They're a great candidate. I can tell you everything you need to know about this student. And interestingly enough, you know, they get promoted to, you know, second in line where they were last or one out of 10 or what have you. So there's a relationship component to that. When it comes to the public school, of course, the public school may say, you know, this is the only school within your area that you're going to be attending. So there may be a choice of one.
As a parent, when I went, me and my wife went to look at schools, there was the range of what was on show varied widely. In other words, the school that we ultimately selected, we could make an assessment of the school based on, you know, public records like report cards. We could look at scores. The Los Angeles County public school system has a reporting system. And then we went to the school, and the school was very good in allowing the parents to sit in on classrooms, speak to both the teachers and the children. So I felt we got a lot of information back, much more information than if we were just looking at records. What do you do when you go into school to get a sense of how appropriate the school is, academic, socially, psychologically for a particular child?
Yeah, the first order of business is clearing it through the administrator and saying, I'm here for this purpose, and I'm interested in this particular class grade level. So let's say it's 5th grade. And I have, you know, a question regarding, you know, what kind of a teacher would work with this type of a profile of student and what particular resources that you'll have in place. Once I narrow that down to a couple of teachers, then in fact, they'll allow me, they'll say, would you like to, you know, spend some time in the classroom, you know, meet the teacher, have an opportunity to see, you know, what the curriculum is that they're using, and have a sense to have a chat regarding approach. And that's what I'll do.
And how much time do you think that involves at the school? How much time do you spend at the school?
I usually spend a morning. You know, I'll go there. It depends whether it's, you know, one student, you know, for one class, or what, it's usually a morning, it's a 3 hour block.
And let's go to the child, looking at the child, because you said earlier on that the important thing is to find the right fit for the school. So that
Yeah.
means that you need to be looking at the child as well. What kind of things do you look at to decide what's a good fit for a particular child?
Yeah, well, and that's again where another rub comes into play in case the parents or the attorneys, you know, don't want me, you know, to spend any time with the child to get kind of an interest survey. And of course, that's dependent on age. But, you know, with the younger child, you know, you get teacher reports and you say, okay, this sounds like an area of interest. So you start working it that way, and developing what you think is a profile based on interest, whether it be, you know, recreation, sports, if it's, you know, art, if it's, you know, the sciences and social studies, you know, and then you look at if there's any type of, you know, learning issue that's going on for the child. How has it been assessed? Number one, and seeing what kind of an assessment was done, and then what would likely be the classroom that could work with a child with that particular learning needs. Of course, you know, when it comes to me and paying for my services, it's oftentimes when the child has some special needs. They're either exceptionally, you know, talented and gifted, or they have some sort of a learning issue and they may be on the autism spectrum. There's something else going on. And so they're not looking at necessarily just that child within the classroom, but they're looking at the school environment and the school culture to see if that child is going to be bullied, if there's enough support with administration and teacher knowledge and training, so they look at, you know, that this child is not going to be impacted or traumatized by what might occur within that school grounds.
Do you also look at the psychology of the child, or use additional psychological testing, maybe educational testing, to see what the aptitudes and abilities of the child are?
Depending upon what the case is, absolutely. Typically, I'll get, if it's a special needs child, for instance, I'll already get the testing that's been administered. And, you know, I've had years and years of, you know, started as a psychometrist early on, went into, you know, educational psychology, went into clinical psychology. So I know the range, and I'll know how to interpret those tests. And if I call into question, has this been done correctly, or how old is this testing, and has anything been done of recent? Is this IEP really what they're using, or is there an IEP that I'm missing here? I'll have a lot of questions that will need to be answered. And depending upon those answers, then I'll determine whether I go in and do additional testing, which I've done, and which attorneys have asked me to do, and the judge has asked me to do that. And I'll go in and do the testing that's necessary at that point in time.
What kind of testing have you done? What are the tests?
Oh, everything from the Wechslers to the Stanford Binets to, you know, the processing test to the Achenbachs to, you know, all the achievement testing. I mean, I don't think there's probably a test out there. I do neuropsychological testing. I do that for the Department of Defense in Europe. So I have a broad knowledge of tests. Now,
I hope you don't have to use the Department of Defense test on any children in California. Maybe some of the hacker children are really good at IT.
It's how far you get away from when the missile drops. You know, that's the test. Like, move to the right. Say, how far do you move to the right? No, the big push now, Warren, in terms of testing, and I just watched this with Pearson. They just did a whole series on this, is that you don't overkill on testing. You really get specific, which has always been my philosophy, is you don't throw everything in the kitchen sink at a child. You have to determine what the area of disability, what it could be. I mean, you're looking for the rationale for the disability, and you're doing testing in that particular area, but you're not doing testing all over the map. And that's where the industry is going, is to say, let's not do everything in the kitchen sink. Let's get down to what really needs to be done and determine what the deficits are, and let's, work with those.
One of the difficult things, kind of philosophically, as it were, is deciding what a good fit or a good school is. You need to have some idea of what is a good outcome. So to give you an example, I went to a very good school in London. Academically, it was very good. And,
I'm not surprised.
extracurricular activities, rugby, cricket, and all that kind of stuff. It was a very good school, but I'm still in touch with a lot of my classmates, and we all agree it was a very traumatic school. There was a lot of bullying. It modeled itself in an old-fashioned public school. The teachers were very disciplinarian. Things happened there that would never be allowed in the US or any other civilized country in the world.
Yeah.
And yet, my peers, we all went off to good colleges, and we now have a really quite comfortable middle-class lives. So in that sense, the outcome was, in the long run, good, even though we sort of get, around a couple of glasses of wine, we all talk about the trauma that we're suffering, which we suffer and still carry with us.
This may not be the channel for you to discuss that trauma. I'm not sure.
I'm being facetious. English humor.
But I think you're right. I think we're resilient human beings. That's what makes us exceptional. We're resilient, and something, that would, we've all been traumatized at some point in time by the school systems, and and I kind of feel on a certain level that, it's like picking up food from the ground, right? And eating it. You don't want to do it every time, but there probably is something to be said that you can eat something off the ground and it's not going to kill you, and you're resilient enough. It's not everything that comes against you in life or onto you in life is necessarily going to be a bad thing that you can't get over and work through.
So I guess my question was really, and I don't know it's possible to answer this, but when you're looking at metrics in terms of educational outcomes, psychological or social outcomes, what weight do you give to those different types of outcomes when you're picking a school?
You mean in terms of what is important and what you're looking at in terms of maturity and where you're going to end up at the end of the day, which is an excellent question. I think, always the parents are looking at the academic success. That's what they're looking at and saying, my kid needs to do this. And, I think about a high conflict case that I had in Monterey County. And the father, was a billionaire, and the mother, they're split, and the mother's saying, we have twins. One girl is fine in this all-girls school. The other twin is not doing well. No, and the father was insistent that they both stay in the same school. And it took me to get in and do an assessment with both of the girls to go back to the father and say, listen, they may look alike, but they're markedly different in the way they see life and the way they interact, on this planet. And the one child, your one daughter, is perfectly fine, and she's got all the friends in the world, and she's in the activity. The other one's not fine. She's not participating. She doesn't feel good about herself. This isn't where she needs to be. She has learning differences that aren't, it's too much academic for her. She can't withstand this. Let me suggest you spend a day with me. Let's go to a school where I think you're going to feel, you can get at least a comparison, and you tell me at the end of the visit what you feel. So I went into the car, we got a car together in Monterey. We went to a school where I knew that it was going to be different enough, and he sat through it and he said, this is great. I know exactly what you mean. She would feel much better here, much more at ease. So I think yes, you look at psychological, if there's an IEP, obviously you're going to be doing all sorts of testing and evaluation. So you're going to have, rubrics and such that you're going to continue to look at goals and objectives. But for most kids, getting a thermometer on, how they feel about the school and their peer group and how they think they're doing is going to be very important, along with the teacher responses. So I do think it's important, to look at the psychological welfare of children. I think that's most important. And then you look at academics and you look at, other types of recreational involvement or sports or clubs and this sort of a thing.
Do you also look at the parents' involvement with the school in terms of participating in homework, teacher-parent conferences, being on the PT board,
Absolutely,
and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I see where you're kind of thinking along those lines, which, and that's difficult for certain parents who are high-profile people who don't have all the time to participate necessarily in all those kind of activities. But, the ones that are truly there for their kids know that they have to give their time. And you do, I think there is something about quality time, but I think it's also quantity. You got to look at both.
Yeah.
And so that's a measurement that could be used, as the amount of time that parents do spend with kids. And the unfortunate part about that is that you'll have one parent who just simply doesn't have that type of a schedule that they can make themselves available at that point. They have the interest, but then I've worked with them in developing other ways that they can still attend without being necessarily physically there. They can still participate.
And now we're getting into that area where we're looking at factors that really go to the fit between the school schedule and the custodial schedule. I imagine that is also a factor where the parents live maybe a little further apart from each other.
Yeah, and then you've got transportation needs, and you have to have before and after school programs to accommodate, their particular schedule. Those are all factors that you have to, contend with. That's part of the framework of this template that John Gould and I developed in determining, what the next steps are, what the steps have to be, and what the next steps are regarding, parents' involvement and the court's involvement. It's all in the article.
So, are you brought in as an independent educational expert, even if there isn't a custody evaluation going on?
Sometimes, yeah, if one side decides that would be of use. But there's always to be a question. There's some type of a question in saying, we're fine where we are right now for grade school, elementary school, but we're not sure where we're going to go for elementary. So they try to get ahead of the ball and saying, let's bring Dr. Burdick in, and he could tell us how our child is doing and what he sees as the next step, and then I'll opine on that.
Now, I want to send my kids to a really good school in Holland, where you are right now, just around the corner from you.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I know you, so you would be a great fit. But what happens when you have to make a decision in a move away case, either a move away to another state or another country? How do you assess the out of state or foreign school? How do you do that?
Yeah, I think, let me give you an example. I've done a couple of these where one was in St. Thomas Island. That was with one of the schools. And then one was in Illinois. And neither of those schools did I have, any experience with. One was a private school. The other one was a quasi-private, a charter school. So having an education background, I know how curriculum has to work on a state standard. So I know what the standards are within that state and what we're trying to finally work towards and moving. This was a middle school child. So I went to St. Thomas Island myself, and I spent a couple of days actually there at the school and getting to know, the culture, because that's something you can't pick up necessarily. And it was a beautiful international school. I mean, they had kids there from all over the world. It wasn't, just the islands, not just the US, but all international. And had I not known that, I would not have been able to go back to the court and say, let me tell you the differences between this school and why I think the school in St. Thomas could be a great school for this child, given the complexion of the parents and their being international. There would be some compelling reasons to attend that school versus the one in Illinois, which was a great school, but it just didn't have the international fabric to it. And would you know, both parents finally agreed. This made complete sense. They were up against each other for a bit, but the mom finally just said, you know what, let me give it a shot. Let's give it, 6 months and see how it goes. And if it doesn't go well, but she stayed. So to answer your question, you need to know education. You need to know, the state regulations. You need to know curriculum. You have to know the peer group. You have to know the child and the parents' expectations. And you put that together. And I insist that I visit the school if I have any questions about the school. And typically, the parents don't have a problem with that. It costs a plane ticket, to get there. That's, not so expensive. It just depends where in the world I am and what I'm doing.
So do you ever investigate or assess the schools remotely because you can't speak the language or find an interpreter?
Oh, that way you mean? Well, to be honest with you, most of my business is with expats who are attending, and their children are attending, international schools. So I actually am a TASIS boarding school. I went to high school in Switzerland myself. So I know the boarding world that you're referring to. But most of my clientele are English speaking and they're attending international schools. When it comes down to a local school, then you have to go through local channels, and you've got to understand the education format for that country. But I'm pretty good with that anymore. When it comes to European countries and UK, and I understand, the A levels, and I know where kids go and what they do, and there's so much overlap with my families. They're going between the US and the UK and the EU all the time anyway. So that's the nature of the beast for me.
Right. And they're very different educational systems, I mean, in so many ways. I think that, I'm just seeing if I have any more questions. You've answered most of my questions, I think. Very well. I suppose there is living in Los Angeles, the biggest
so sorry for you.
observation, is the stark contrast between the public school system and the private school system.
Right.
It's like comparing apples and oranges. Is that something? Are you good at comparing apples and oranges in that sense?
Well, I worked. I did administration for Palo Alto schools, and I worked in an administrative role for a number of school districts, even Los Angeles Unified. So I know the differences between private and public school systems. So yeah, I do that all the time. But most of my clientele are coming and saying we're going private to private.
It's always
That's
private.
typical.
Yeah.
Not always, but they're people, they're families of means, and they're looking, for safe, havens to raise children, and they do want, results, and so they'll go to private schools and they expect that. But there are some very good public schools in Los Angeles. I mean,
Absolutely.
there are exceptional schools, charter schools, just regular public schools. I mean, as it is in New York and any metropolitan city, there are great public school choices. And I'm the last one to say, nah, forget those, look at the private schools. I'll look at both.
And is that a factor that is taken into account when a judge is making a decision between one parent who wants a public school and one parent that wants a private school? Is there a
The
bias?
one there, what I think gets confusing for judges, and is they'll get information fed to them about statistics for a public school, for example. Public schools are transparent. They'll tell you how many expulsions, suspensions, knifings, whatever's going on, your kids on free lunch, they'll give you all that information. It's available to you.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to the private school, that information isn't available. They can't tell you, well, some schools will when they get onto the high school looking at college, but like middle schools and such won't necessarily tell you how kids are scoring on standardized testing. You may not have that information because it isn't necessary for them to publish it, so they don't have it. Yes, parents know kind of what, is going on, but there's nothing definitive for a judge to look at and say, okay, here, I see what you're saying. This normative population is, between 95 and 105 and one standard deviation above on the one and not the other. They can see that, but when it comes down to private and public schools, that may not be so evident. So I have to go in and educate and saying, yes, Your Honor, but there's some differences here in terms of what the grade level is and what the performance is based on the interests of this child. And just let me kind of run you through what that looks like for that child at that grade in that particular school. And I've had judges just thank me profusely because they had no idea how to interpret this data. They just had no idea. And the one judge in Florida completely got it wrong. And I had to go in there and say, I understand you're confused, but listen, let me help you walk through this and let me show you what the differences in the performance data really does indicate. And she was very appreciative. So that's where the training and expertise comes in.
Did you ever get retained as an expert by one of the parents as opposed to joint expert?
Yeah.
Well, I think this has been an excellent conversation. I certainly wish I brought you into the picture when we were choosing a school, or when my parents were choosing a school. I don't know you're that old, but
well, no, I'm not that old. No, but
this has been a really good conversation.
Well, and I'm always good for anybody who's watching this, and me. I mean, we'll sit down at Clementine's together and have lunch and discuss things or what have you. But I'm always good to just kind of bounce things off of them. I'm not going to charge. As you are, you're great about doing that and giving feedback, just to see whether it's a fit for someone like me to be involved. If it's not, I'll be the first one to refer and say, look at this person, they're a better match for what you're looking for, or read these articles. So I think it's, we're all busy enough that we don't have to, to put ourselves in a position where we don't feel that we're giving our best to the clients.
Absolutely. So I want to thank you very much again. My name is Warren Scheel. I'm a divorce lawyer who practices in California. And at the bottom of this, we'll put a description of how you contact both of us. Mark, over to you.
Keep the faith, brother. Keep the faith. We'll get through this. Thanks, Warren, for the time. Huh? I appreciate it.